Well, let me bring Martin in on that exact point because we've seen an increase in the number of visa spots, both within domestic leagues and with that flowing onto the Champions League as well, to the point where I think we're now almost at the point in Saudi Arabia where 75% of the squad can be visa players, and if they can, they will. So where does that leave younger Saudi players? We saw this in the World Cup as well. Some of these players in the squad were coming from second tier leagues or weren't starters in their team. So, what does it? Yeah, what kind of a message does it send to young Saudi players? I mean, okay, it's great to have an opportunity to play, with a Ronaldo or a Benzema or whatever. But if that's only three kind of players, it's not much of a pathway for younger players. So ultimately, is this something that's damaging to the future of Saudi football, particularly the national teams?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because as you say, it's on two sides of things. And you can see that immediately. I can see that there's an improvement, especially in the Saudi players that are around. Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, are picking up the bits that they wouldn't be able to get on a kind of a usual basis. But in terms of the expansion that's discussed, in terms of having 6 to 8 players in your starting lineup, where are the opportunities going to come from, especially for attacking players? We've seen that already with Firas Al Barakan, one of the players that played against Lionel Messi when Saudi Arabia beat Argentina, effectively the top attacking talent for Saudi Arabia moving forward, who's decided to stay at a mid-table club because the opportunities to go and play in one of the leading lights in Saudi Arabia aren't going to be there for him. And that just develops a slightly different player. These kind of examples that have been kind of mirrored across China and from Qatar as well. Almoez Ali being the kind of prime example of a player that we thought was destined for kind of greatness, who is even a bit part player playing in Qatar, just because of the kind of presence and the prestige put on some overseas players. So I think that's the concern, that it's too focused on the international signings rather than the younger players. What they have to look at is the structures, as you say, from the bottom up, in terms of structures for youth development, a philosophy of how we want to be playing, which I think Saudi Arabia get, and they are putting a lot more effort than potentially China ever did. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to get squeezed out of a market, and if there isn't that kind of appetite to move abroad, or there isn't a reason to be doing that, I don't think there's going to be that explosion of talent in Saudi Arabia that we'll see Saudi Arabia contest further on into a World Cup campaign like Japan did.
Paul, just bringing you in, just again, one technical question without notice. Firstly, in terms of, we've seen UEFA certainly be very strong on this idea that they don't want ownership, the multi-club kind of thing spread across into their tournaments, although that may be eased in the future as well. But is that a kind of thing that you can see falling foul of the AFC in any way, firstly? And then just in terms of the broader picture, particularly a lot of the commentary that's come not just in this regard, but in other nations in the region, in Qatar and certainly here in Saudi Arabia, we see this new term. I'm not sure when it was coined. This whole sports washing thing, which can probably be applied to a lot of different nations. But for you, just that two element, is this another example of what the English press would term sports washing, and where do you see, if we've got 4 teams making the semi-finals of the Champions League in future years with a one owner, is that something that the AFC you could imagine would clamp down on?
Could get me into trouble with this sports washing one. I'll start on your first question on the multi-club ownership. I don't think it's going to be something that will necessarily fall foul of AFC. I mean, I was speaking to someone who's very well versed in this field, and as they said, multi-club ownership, it's just a thing. It exists now. It's not going away. It's going to probably just get deeper and deeper into the game of football. So you build safeguards into your regulations rather than try and regulate it out of the game, because it's a part of football that exists now. Ironically, given that we're talking about Messi going to MLS, the best example, recent, if you want to call it that, example that I can think of is probably MLS a little bit before David Beckham arrived, when all of the clubs in the league were effectively owned by 2 or 3 owners. the owners of LA Galaxy, as they were at the time, can't remember exactly the name of the owners, but they owned 4 or 5 clubs within the league because the league had to do that because they couldn't get anyone to own the clubs. So they had to get all of these owners to prop up these clubs until it got to a point that other private investors wanted to come on board. So I don't necessarily see it being an issue, and Wael will be sort of best versed to talk to that as well. I don't see fans in Saudi Arabia seeing it as an issue as well. I don't see AFC seeing it as an issue. We've seen, multiple CFG groups compete in the Champions League in the past. We've had, Melbourne City and Mumbai City, obviously on opposite sides, but they've competed in the same tournament. We had Mumbai City play Al Jazeera, which for all intents and purposes have the same owner in Sheikh Mansour as well. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. It wouldn't have got to this point if it was going to be an issue. On the discussion of sports washing, it's a term that, as you said, who knows when it was created. It's a term developed by the West and used by the West to almost weaponize against developing nations who aspire to be something more than they want to be. Sure, Saudi Arabia's had a very, very checkered past. It has a bit of a checkered present with some of the things that it's done recently as well, and they deserve criticism for that as well. But I think what you're seeing isn't necessarily an attempt to wash its reputation. I think what you're seeing is a genuine attempt to reform its society. There is, Wael will correct me on the figures here, I think 60 to 70% of the population is aged under 35 or 40. So it's a very young generation who grow up on social media, who are exposed a lot more to, Western culture and the way of the West. And that's what they want for their society. They're probably a little bit more liberal in their thinking as well. And that is the society that they want for Saudi Arabia. So, the Crown Prince, for all of his faults, he knows that, if he wants to remain in power, he has to provide them with the society that they want. But if, 60% of the population is under 40 or 35 or whatever it is, I mean, 40% of the population is probably still from that old conservative background. So that they're sort of balancing both worlds at the moment while they sort of get themselves to the point where, Saudi Arabian society has completely changed. It's changed so much already in, the 8 or so years since that Vision 2030 has been developed. And I'll get Wael to talk about this because, you grew up in Saudi Arabia. You've left the country. You've lived in, other parts of the Gulf as well. You've moved back there recently. Speak to us about that term sports washing and about the change that has taken place in Saudi Arabia, and whether you see it as the same way, that it is a genuine change to reform the society rather than trying to create what the term sports washing is, I assume, trying to say that it's a mirage for us to see, whereas, things actually, the reality is very different.
Yeah, if I am to say anything, I think the first thing I would say is the term sports washing. What it does is really presumes that the West's viewpoint is the center of everything. And, at the end of the day, if we look at Vision 2030, if we look at this project, if we look at a lot of the reforms that have happened for Saudi Arabia, they have happened primarily and mostly for domestic reasons, regardless of what everyone else thinks of the country. I mean, Saudi Arabia was the way it was, and it was arguably the most conservative country on the planet for 80 years, and that has not stopped it from being the United States' biggest ally, right? So there's no reason to think that they decided to change now because they want the United States or they want Europe or they want anyone else to praise them for that. There were objective reasons, as you've mentioned, Paul, doing with the new demographics in the country, with the population wants, in terms of the social contract of the nation itself, right? So obviously, this is not a country where you have the traditional Western social contract of taxation and representation. Now, It's a monarchy. It's an absolute monarchy. It's an agent. It's a nation that has grown from tribal origins, from tribal loyalties, to be led by that royal family from which the nation takes its name, right? So it is Saudi Arabia. Its whole identity revolves around the existence of the Saudi, the Al Saud, the royal family. So the way the social contract works is completely different, and with the changes of demographics, and let's remember also a big part of that cultural change actually resulted in from the government's own initiatives. Uh, if we look back at around 2005, when King Abdullah, the late king, came to power, one of the biggest projects he undertook was the what was called the National Scholarships Program, where he sent 100,000 Saudi students to study on government's expense in the US, in Canada, in the UK, and in Australia. So this entire generation that went, it was 100,000 for 1 year, and then continued for, like, I think the best part of 10 years, this program. So that entire generation spent 5 years at least in Western countries, came back with Western education, with a lot of values that they've learned from the West, good and bad. They've come in with a different way of thinking, and obviously that now they want things differently. And as you rightly said, Paul, I think in the most recent census, it was 65% under the age of 35. So that's a huge part of the population. And when you add on top of that, obviously, nearly 50% of the population that are women who have been deprived of some of their most basic rights for many decades. And the crown princes come in, and Alan obviously brought in massive changes, introducing them into the workforce, allowing them to be an active part of society. So this is the actual constituency, if that's the right word, that the government is trying to appease, if you want to say that, by making these reforms. Not at all Western media or the West in general.
Mm. So then, picking up off the back of that, it was almost pitted the way it was reported, and it's always dangerous to take social media as a gauge for anything. But the signing of Messi to MLS rather than going to Saudi Arabia, it was the way it was reported, the way it was received, the way people were tweeting about it was almost seen as like it was a win for the good guys, and it was a middle finger to Saudi Arabia that he was going to MLS rather than he was going to Saudi Arabia. I even saw one person suggest that him choosing Miami over Halal helped preserve his Barcelona legacy, as if that would have been destroyed by moving to Hilal. I'm not quite sure I get the logic. There was a tweet that was doing the rounds in my circles that suggested this was a win for liberal values, as opposed to those of Saudi Arabia. And I can see how you would arrive at that view, but let's not forget where he's actually going here. He's going to a club in Florida, and if you want to talk about liberal values, just look up what's happening in Florida at the moment as well. So there was almost like a geopolitical connotation to his signing. And I guess in one sense, the natural advantage that a club or clubs in MLS have over Saudi Arabia is that they're probably 20 years further developed in their own revolution that started when David Beckham. So, moving to MLS has been normalized, so to speak. It's almost an accepted, rite of passage for players as they get to their 30s. You go off to the MLS, and for players from Western Europe who, the US is seen as like a social and cultural sort of beacon for the world. They're naturally predisposed to going to play in cities and in a country that they're incredibly familiar with, which is why I think the comments of Karim Benzema last night at his unveiling are really interesting as well, and perhaps point to where Saudi Arabia can have success. Not that they're not going to have success elsewhere as well. But he made the point that him being a Muslim was key to him choosing to go to Saudi Arabia, and obviously, being close to holy sites and being close to Mecca and the other religious touch points in all of that was really important for him and his family. So I can see Saudi Arabia perhaps having more success in targeting, high profile Muslim players. And obviously it depends, and we spoke about this well offline, how much religion plays a role in their life. But, players like Riyad Mahrez, we've seen linked, Mo Salah, Hakim Ziyech, Paul Pogba, all of these players, perhaps they're going to have more success in trying to target these players who maybe they're more predisposed to moving to Saudi because of their own religious backgrounds. Do you see it the same way?
Well, yeah, I'll add to the list that you mentioned Golo Kante, who's just about to sign for them as well, right? So uh, I think that plays a part. Obviously, there is a huge attraction for Muslims, especially if you're signing for a club like Etihad, who are just an hour's drive from the Holy Mosque in Mecca, right? So that being said, I think Saudi Arabia is conscious, and rightfully so, of not changing this into something that is a scene for a cultural battle. Nobody wants this to obviously be changed into an us versus them, into, okay, this is the league where the Muslims go, and this is the league where everyone else goes. That helps absolutely no one, neither the Saudi, neither the general, football scene. Nobody wants football to be a scene for a cultural battle like this. So I think obviously, if that gives you a competitive advantage when negotiating with a certain player, I think that's definitely going to be used. But I really don't think it's going to be primarily used to draft up a list of players to approach. I don't think it's going to be used as a strategic part of the project. Yes, obviously happens to be. If you go and talk to Mo Salah, it's a huge advantage. And my understanding is he is someone they will be talking to at a later point. He was even suggested that he would be the name they would actually go to replace Messi. Because obviously, if you've missed out on Messi, you need to make a huge statement, and they don't come as bigger as Mo Salah. He's not obviously not the same player, but he is someone at that level in this point of time, as at the very top of global football. But yeah, if it's a Salah, if it's a Mahrez, if it's someone of that magnitude, and you go talk to them, that will come up in the conversation. But yeah, I highly doubt that will be a strategic part of it.
Michael, just quickly to wrap this up before we move on to the Ange Postecoglou discussion. If we look at, I guess, some of the restrictions, if you want, in other leagues in Asia. I mean, the A League operates in a salary cap environment down there. Japan, it's forbidden to have majority foreign ownership in the J League. And we know that Japanese clubs aren't particularly investing heavily in domestic football either. So on a continental level, in terms of the Champions League, does this have the potential now to, I mean, obviously, the record is very, very strong anyway in Saudi, but I mean, to almost, in a way, leave some of these other nations behind? Or could this perhaps be the spur for change in other leagues? Will we see the salary cap disappear in Australia? Will we see the J League open up to at least on the books level, or maybe there's some behind the scenes stuff going on with ownership models here? But in terms of above board, majority foreign ownership as well, could this be a revolution, not just in Saudi Arabian football, but then spreading the winds right throughout the continent?
It could be, Scott, but I think if we look at it in relation purely to the Champions League, we effectively have two competitions running concurrent in the Champions League anyway, and have had for a number of years now, where we effectively have a West Asian Champions League and an East Asian Champions League, and two conferences, and the winners of each of those playing off against each other in the final. And it's increasingly become the case that it's Japan dominates in the East, and Saudi Arabia has dominated in the West, and then it's a playoff between the two. So from in those terms, I don't think we'll see the development of some kind of arms race because of what's going on in Saudi Arabia, and then a knock-on effect into the Champions League. But I do think what it will do is it will highlight the stark differences that do exist across the continent. And you mentioned Australia. I mean, Australian clubs, Australian coaches have for a long time been I've taken the opportunity to highlight the fact that they are at a massive competitive disadvantage when they play in the AFC Champions League. And that's the case, but it's increasingly, and that was the case even within East Asia when the Chinese clubs were spending huge sums of money to bring foreign players in, and clubs like Guangzhou were stockpiling all of the national team talent so that they could go on and push for success at continental level there. It hasn't made a massive difference around that. What happened within Chinese football hasn't necessarily made a massive difference to the club game elsewhere around the region, and I'm not entirely sure that Saudi Arabia doing this, certainly in the short to medium term, will have that impact. Longer term, potentially, but we're already seeing changes in the Champions League as it is coming up, not in the next edition of the competition, but the one after, where there are obviously changes in the number of foreign players that are allowed to be used, change format. Everything is pretty much being overhauled. So let's see. I think in some respects it also it's reflective of how much clubs and leagues and national associations, how much importance they actually place on the Champions League, and obviously that varies across the continent.